Several other bills surrounding PFAS were presented to lawmakers in Augusta today. One of those proposes a change to the definition of the forever chemicals. Kodichi Lawrence has more.
5 different bills surrounding PFAS were presented to lawmakers Wednesday, including one proposing to change the laws governing products made with forever chemicals.
First, it changes how PFAS is currently defined to narrow the scope and to make the law more realistic to comply with.
State Senator Joe Baldacci says the state does not have the lab capacity or the technology to test for the definition of the current statute, which includes 15,000 chemical compound.
We need to narrow that scope, at least in the interim, until the technology and the capacity changes.
Senator Henry Ingwerson disagrees.
It is also the consistent definition used in a bill to test farmland, a Maine sludge ban bill, and it's in our current drinking water standards bill. The definition proposed in LD 1214 leaves out a whole host of harmful chemicals.
The Sustainable PFAS Action Network says others, including the United States Environmental Protection Agencies, have adapted these definitions, and so should the state. They say the definition of PFAS should reflect the nature of PFAS usage in the economy.
Defining PFAS as 2 fully fluorinated carbon atoms, which contain several thousand compounds, including many of the legacy compounds, will help Maine employers comply with the statute and regulators more effectively identify compounds responsible for contamination issues.
Ben Lucas with the state's Chamber of Commerce says they support eliminating PFAS in human contact, but says a change needs to be made to enable this.
The current structure, when you're trying to test and report potentially hundreds of thousands of different products for over 15,000 different chemical compounds, that's a very, very challenging thing for the business community to be able to comply with. These are very complex products to test for. It's very costly, and we simply just don't have the lab capacity in Maine and frankly across the United States to be able to comply with the law as is.
Kodichi Lawrence, WABI TV 5 News, Augusta.